There we go. I am I'm at St Helens Bishopsgate part-time working on the staff of the Cornhill training course in London. I'm living in Borough, sort of quite near the market or the Shard, if that's more recognisable to you, in central London. And at the minute I'm at home with COVID, and so are all my children are at home. Two of them also have positive tests, so that's where we're up to. But actually it's been quite nice to have the opportunity to get some stuff done. So there we go. And I think I'm due to speak to you about Proverbs. Is that right? Everyone happy? I am going to have a go at sharing my screen. And oh no, I'm not enabled. Tom, is there any? Oh, there we go. Great, thank you so much. So here we go. Let's share this slideshow from the beginning. Brilliant. I think I'm going to talk to you about Proverbs. Now, Tom suggested that I needed to speak for 25 minutes and to be maximally provocative for those 25 minutes. So that's what I'm going to aim for, maximum provocation, whilst also trying to be wise in the things that I've said. So where should I start with the book of Proverbs? Well, it started with a king. Actually, that's not quite true. It started with a good deal more muddle than that makes it sound. My first exposure that I remember to the book of Proverbs was listening to a talk by J. John, the evangelist, a very long time ago as a teenager. And he said something about Proverbs chapter 30, and there's a verse in Proverbs 30 about twisting a nose producing blood. And he had some anecdote about having been standing up doing street evangelism, and somebody telling him that the Bible wasn't true, and he had asked them to test out Proverbs 30 and whether twisting noses produced blood, and it did. And the person then joined him on the platform, telling everybody that you should believe the Bible because every word it said was true. Which, is a very interesting anecdote, but I'm not sure it got me very much further on understanding the book of Proverbs. I then did what I'm sure we've all done and read Proverbs periodically in my family, in my Bible time. And as I did that, I discovered that very often it rang very true, that it felt quite wise to me, particularly in convicting me as a young man on lust and the need for sexual purity, and also on sins of speech. I found that there's an awful lot Proverbs had to say about how to use your words wisely. But more or less, I read it every so often and thought there's a lot of stuff that I could learn, and that was about all that I took from it. And then this is really provocative. I studied it in a Bible read-through with somebody, and in that Bible read-through, we were encouraged to conclude that the whole point of Proverbs was that you're supposed to get to chapter 30 at the end, and it's a very significant chapter in the book. Actually, I'll come on to that a bit later on. And in chapter 30, it says, "I have not learned wisdom." And the point is, you're supposed to learn and read Proverbs as a quest for wisdom and come to the conclusion that it wasn't very wise. Well, that is provocative, and it's not quite where I'm going to go in our time together this lunchtime. But then everything changed, and it changed. I think I can date it to somewhere around the beginning of 2010, when I went along to a conference organised by the Good Book Company called the Bible-Centered Youth Worker Conference. And that year they were thinking a bit about wisdom, for whatever reason, we had these kind of small groups where we were encouraged to give talks and to get feedback on these talks. And the passage that I was assigned was Proverbs chapter 8, and it got me really beginning to think. The thought that I had as I looked at that passage, which proved to be very significant for me, was that what if you read Proverbs paying attention to the fact that it seemed to be quite interested in Solomon? It's a dangerous thought. And what if Solomon, and especially the Solomon as described in 1 Kings chapters 1 to 11, is relevant to how you understand the book of Proverbs? Proverbs does insist that you should be thinking of Solomon and Solomon as king as you read this book. You get it in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 1. We're told that these are the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. Again, you're reminded after 9 chapters of instructions in chapter 10 and verse 1, when you actually start the Proverbs, that these are the Proverbs of Solomon. And again in chapter 25 verse 1, and you're reminded that these are the Proverbs of Solomon, collected this time by the men of Hezekiah, who, if you know your Bible history, you'll know was king in David's line, a descendant of Solomon, about 250 years after Solomon died. Actually, Hezekiah is very important, but that's a matter for another time. We can talk about that if I'm invited back ever. So how does that change the way that you read Proverbs? Well, you might think, of course, Solomon's relevant to Proverbs, and often people have suggested that you should read Proverbs as kind of wisdom from the king. And that's the general thought, that by saying that Solomon is the guy responsible for this, it encourages us to kind of take it more seriously. Solomon was a very wise guy, after all. Famously, he asked for wisdom before he began his reign, and he was given it. And so if wisdom comes with Solomon's name attached to it, well, it must be worth listening to. Except, of course, it's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it? Because, in fact, there's a very strong case for suggesting that in 1 Kings 1-11, Solomon is portrayed as something of a royal fool. Sure, he asked for wisdom and he got it. But in the end, Solomon chose the worst kind of folly, turning away from the fear of the Lord and letting his wives lead him into the worship of foreign gods. And so if the only point of having Solomon's name attached to it is to make you think this must be very wise, well, you've got to think that there might be something missing. And also, of course, it would matter if Proverbs expected you to know Solomon's story a little bit. And it seems to me that it does. The connection between Proverbs and what you find in the book of Solomon does seem to be fairly tight. First of all, it's not just that you have that kind of reminder in 1 verse 1 that these are the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. You get this repeated genre through the first 9 chapters of the book. It's called instruction, these poems that are from a parent and from a father to their son. And of course, if the father in view is Solomon, then the son is a royal son. In other words, you might say a prince. And this is something like what the father, the king, is saying to their son, the prince, perhaps the prince in David's line. Another reason for thinking that there's a picture of the prince. I thought you might enjoy that. Another reason why you might think that the connection with Solomon is tighter than just this general vague sense that Solomon was very wise, and that this might be quite wise too, is that as you read chapters 1-9 in Proverbs, there are all sorts of echoes of Solomon as he was described in 1 Kings 1-11. Now, I'm going to come back to talk about the canonical context of Proverbs a bit later, and that might help us to think about why there are these echoes. But there certainly are echoes of Solomon. And so let me give you just a few. First of all, Proverbs insists, just as 1 Kings does, that the reason why you might want wisdom, the kind of wisdom that these Proverbs give, is in order that you might rule. And by me, kings reign, wisdom says, as she's speaking to Solomon, to the reader in Proverbs chapter 8. And of course, that's why Solomon asked for wisdom in the first place, and was so that he could rule God's great people in 1 Kings chapter 3. Wisdom in Proverbs 1-9 is pictured as being on a path, not turning aside to the right hand or to the left, but walking in this pathway. And more than that, there's all sorts of imagery for what you're supposed to do with Solomon that echoes Deuteronomy. And so it says in Proverbs that you should bind her to the tablet of your heart. And it's all these kind of images that come from the early chapters of Deuteronomy and the way that Deuteronomy talks about the law. And again, that's a reminder that what we're talking about here, it's not just any old kind of wisdom and just some general tips for how to get on in life. It's specifically about how you walk in the law of the Lord, how you walk in his covenant and not turning aside to the right hand or to the left, which of course was what Solomon had to do as the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. Again, we're reminded in Proverbs chapter 3 and Proverbs chapter 8 that wisdom is like the genie that keeps on giving. And you know how when you rub a lamp and a genie comes out, the thing you're not supposed to ask for is infinite wishes. Well, it turns out that if you want to ask for infinite wishes, but you can't quite ask for her because that's a technicality, then what you should ask for instead is wisdom. Because when Solomon asked the Lord for wisdom, he not only got wisdom in 1 Kings chapter 3, but he got all the things he didn't ask for as well. So long life and the lives of his enemies and gold and silver and jewels. And again, as you read through Proverbs 1 to 9, we're reminded in chapter 3 and in chapter 9 that wisdom is like that. But if you ask for wisdom, you get wisdom, but also long life and riches, jewels, honor are in her right hand. But if you get her, you get those things with her. More than that, wisdom is depicted as being something like the tree of life in chapter 3, back in the Garden of Eden. And now, again, we don't have time for this, but Genesis chapters 2 and 3 is kind of a wisdom story. And Proverbs wants to remind you of that, that wisdom is what you need if you want to build a new Eden. And again, if you know 1 Kings 1 to 11, you might know that that is the way that Solomon's reign is kind of depicted in those chapters. And wisdom's great enemy in the book of Proverbs is, well, it's a woman. You get a series of warnings in Proverbs 1 to 9 about the adulterous woman in our English translations. So in chapter 5, again in chapter 6, again in chapter 7, and then people would argue that in chapter 9 you have this kind of contrast between wisdom and folly, but folly in chapter 9 is depicted, is kind of everything that Proverbs has said about the adulterous woman so far, but kind of taken up to the symbolic level. And so the ultimate enemy of wisdom is this adulterous woman, but actually the word adulterous woman in Proverbs isn't really adulterous. It's the word foreign, the foreign woman. And if you know the Solomon story, you know that the thing that led Solomon away from wisdom and the fear of the Lord was his foreign wives. And so in all sorts of ways, Proverbs seems to expect you to know and to be able to hear echoes of the story of 1 Kings 1 to 11. Now, that's really important for a couple of reasons. And firstly, it reminds us that wisdom is a king thing. In other words, the reason that you want wisdom is not just so that you succeed at life, but the reason that you want wisdom is so that you can rule. And that's why Solomon wanted wisdom. And I think that's what Proverbs is offering too. There's a little phrase in the prologue, righteousness, justice, and equity in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 3. It gets repeated again in chapter 2 as well, that if you choose wisdom, if you search her as though for jewels, and then what she will bring is, well, the fear of the Lord, first of all, and then righteousness, justice, and equity. I mean, that little phrase, it's a Hebrew way of saying kind of good governance, as in it's a way of saying that you'll be able to rule well. And so wisdom is a king thing. But it also suggested to me as I began to think about this, that Proverbs, it has a frame, as there's a way to read it. Now, of course, this is kind of obvious when you think about it, but I think often what happens with Proverbs is that we try to work out what it is by sampling some of the individual sentence proverbs that we find in Proverbs chapters 10 to 29. Again, if you know anything about the book, you'll know that you begin with 9 chapters of these fairly long 10, 25, 30 verse poems addressed to my son and a couple of poems to wisdom. You end with the acrostic about the woman, the excellent woman in chapter 31, and again a couple of sort of slightly longer poems from Agur and Lemuel. But in between, you get chapters and chapters and chapters of one-liners, just these, well, in fact, two-liners, these kind of two-line sentence proverbs comparing two halves again and again and again for most of 19 chapters. And often what we do with Proverbs is we try to work out what the book is by starting with those one-liners in the middle of the book. But the thing that struck me was that actually what Proverbs has a really very clear frame that's set around the book, and that maybe chapters 1 to 9 and 30 and 31 might help. To begin with, Proverbs is a book that is fairly clearly divided into 7 sections, and that might help us. And maybe it's not a coincidence that wisdom talks about the fact that she's built her 7-pillared house in chapter 9, as if maybe you're supposed to realize that that is what has been done in the book as a whole. Anyway, I'll leave that for you to think about. So 7 sections as you go through the book. Again, very strongly marked by the kind of the final editor or author of the book of Proverbs. And so 1 to 9, you have these 9 chapters of these instructions with a couple of talks from wisdom in the middle of them. And then chapter 10, verse 1, these are the Proverbs of Solomon. And then that runs through a series of one-liners that takes you all the way up to 22:16. Although some people have suggested you can divide that into 2 sections, somewhere around the end of 15, beginning of 16. Then again, 22, verse 17 to 24:22, the words of the wise. Then 24:23 to 34, these are more words of the wise. 25, verse 1, these are the Proverbs of Solomon collected by the men of Hezekiah. 30, verse 1, the words of Agur. And 31, verse 1, the words of Lemuel. Now that's all just there on the surface. You could skim through Proverbs and it'd take you about 5 minutes to discover that stuff. But it turns out, as you probably know is true with trying to read the Bible, that structure is probably quite useful to understanding it. And I think this is going to be really helpful for us. But one of the things that it does in particular is it helps us to see that Proverbs begins and ends quite similarly. And then that maybe gives us a context for what comes in between. So it begins with these 9 chapters, chapters 1 to 9. And essentially what these 9 chapters are doing is that a father, a royal father, is addressing a presumably royal son and telling the son to choose wisdom. And wisdom in those chapters is portrayed as a woman in chapter 3 and chapter 1 and chapter 8. And then at the end, in chapter 31, you have another royal son, King Lemuel, who is reminding you of the words that his mother taught him when he was an infant in his cot. It might be significant, again, for the kind of the biblical theology geeks, that in chapters 1 to 9, it's the father addressing the son, but in 31, it's the mother addressing her son. And that might be an important fact. But anyway, we can leave that to one side. And here's a mother addressing her son and telling her son, on the one hand, to make sure that he rules wisely and does what is right, that he opens his mouth for the needs of the poor and the oppressed, that he rules rightly and does justice, but also that he doesn't give his strength away to women. And then in chapter 31, at the second half, you have this depiction of the strong woman. So I said, don't give your strength away to women, which is, of course, what Solomon did with all of his foreign wives. But do rather find the strong woman in chapter 31, who I think you're supposed to think is kind of a concrete description of what wisdom might look like from chapters 1 to 9. And in between, you get 10 to 29, all of these one-liners. And there's chapters 30 and 31. I think they work together as a pair, in fact, those chapters at the end, which is one of the reasons why I think they're part of a frame. And there's a set of observations that some scholars have made about how they might work together as 2 chapters at the end. And I shan't go into all of them now, although I think thinking about 30 and 31 is really important. Here's Peter Lightheart saying how he thinks that frame might help us to read what comes in between. In the first 8 chapters of Proverbs, chapter 9 chapters actually, 2 women are presented, Dame Folly and Lady Wisdom. The prince, Solomon's son, must decide which he will embrace as his brides. At the end of the book, we learn that the prince has resisted the temptations of Dame Folly. Proverbs 31 describes the superhuman labors of the excellent wife, and we know that the prince has chosen well, that he's made Lady Wisdom his queen. And then I think he goes on to say that the implication is that what we got in between chapters 10 to 29 is the curriculum that kind of got him there. Now, I think that's slightly oversimple, but it'll do, and it's very helpful. And it helps you to understand that as you're reading Proverbs, you want to read what you get in the middle through the lens of this introduction and this conclusion either side of it. A third thing that then helped me a bit more was to think about the canonical context. Now, this is a simple point, and I'm not going to make a big thing of it, But often when we read wisdom literature, so that's Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and then some people want to add one or two other books to the list, we read it quite contextlessly. So perhaps we read it as just a collection of wisdom books that aren't really interested in the rest of the story of the Bible. And it might not surprise you to find out that lots of secular scholars want to read them that way, and to kind of divorce them from the context of the rest of the Bible. Sometimes we read it in the way that we're encouraged to by our English order of Bible books, which is to read the wisdom books as kind of books of poetry that sort of come somewhere after the history, but before any of the prophecy stuff. And so we're reflecting on the history. We haven't yet got to any of the stuff that's in kind of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, that sort of thing. But we're doing a bit of reflection on things that kings might have thought in between times. But you might know that that's not quite the right order to read the Old Testament in terms of thinking these things through. And in their sort of original Hebrew Old Testament context, the way that the Lord Jesus would have ordered his Old Testament, actually these wisdom books, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, they all come in the writings. And the key thing to understand about the writings is that they come last. So first of all, you have the law, then you have the prophets, and the prophets goes all the way from Joshua through to Malachi. And then after the law, you have the writings, so Psalms and Job and Proverbs, Lamentations, 1 and 2 Chronicles, some of those books. That's again a whole other topic. But again, it's quite interesting because it really helped me to go, oh, right, Proverbs is in the writings. And that means that in its canonical context, Proverbs expects you to know 1 Kings 1 to 11. It doesn't expect you to be surprised by this. It also expects you to know Isaiah, which is quite interesting, before you read the book of Proverbs. So how are we doing? Well, we said that wisdom's kind of a king thing. Solomon might be important. You're supposed to know 1 Kings 1 to 11. Actually, you're supposed to know Genesis 1 to 3 as well. But there's a frame around the book, a kind of an introduction and a conclusion, and that encourages you to think that we're getting from a kind of a raw prince through to a wise, well-married king, and that what comes in between is doing something to help us to get there. What about 10 to 29? Well, at this point, it's important to notice the genre of the book of Proverbs, because the book of Proverbs it's all poetry. It's the most consistently parallelistic book, I think, in the entire Old Testament. So you might know that the genius of Hebrew poetry is what's called parallelism, and that's where you sort of say the same thing twice, although that's not quite true, but let's run with that for the minute. You sort of say the same thing twice, and the whole of Proverbs very tightly is written in parallelism, especially chapters 10 to 29, all of these one-liners. They're actually two-liners, where you have 2 lines very tight next to each other that are encouraging you to kind of compare 2 things, or to hold them together, or to think about things. Actually, they're very terse. So in English, when we translate it, we tend to kind of over-translate Proverbs and kind of add in lots of extra words to sort of fill out the gaps and help to sort of make the connections less ambiguous, because it's quite hard to translate poetry, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so our English translations of Proverbs are actually quite a lot longer, maybe 50% longer than the original Hebrew, because we keep filling in the gaps in the way that we translate it. But in the Hebrew, you have these very short, very terse, kind of 2 lines next to each other with lots of ambiguity between how you connect it. Now, you're trying to train a prince to be king. Why do you use poetry? Why would you do that? Why do you give them all of these one-liners? It's very interesting, isn't it? When Plato wanted to think about who should be king, Plato thought that who you really wanted to be king was philosophers, people who were capable of great big abstract schemes of thought. Well, Plato was a philosopher, so I guess, of course, he thought that. But Solomon seems to think that maybe a poet would be more appropriate. And why is it? Why would all of these 2-liners be useful for training a prince? And I think the key is that it's all about naming things, but it's also all about comparisons. All of these 2-liners, you're holding things next to each other, and you're being forced to make connections between things and to see how things fit together. And as we'll think about in just a minute, that's really important to being able to decide and to rule wisely is understanding why things work together the way they do, and what things line up together, what things connect, and what patterns are at play and at work in the world as you're going through things. Robert Alter, the secular Jewish expert in Hebrew poetry, he says that Proverbs is full of what he calls the poetry of wit. So lots of these two-liners that are actually quite witty as you think about how things connect to each other. And Michael Fox, again, another Jewish scholar on Proverbs and the wisdom literature, and not the guy who was in the Back to the Future movies, but Michael Fox, he says that Proverbs is written in such a way that the individual Proverbs train you how to think. And so I guess you could think of it as poetry, or you could think of it as stand-up comedy, I suppose, as all these one-liners. It's a bit like a Tim Vine gig or something like that. And as I said, the reason is that it's all about kind of making connections. But is there anything more to say about these middle chapter parts? Like, there's lots of these one-liners that force you to make connections. I think there is. I think, in fact, there is a curriculum. Now, when we first encounter Proverbs 10 to 29, it comes across to us as like something like a wall, and maybe this little ThinkFor50 is coming across as a bit like a wall right now, full of this dense kind of 2 lines packets of information that are just impossible to prise apart or to see any structure or order to it. But in fact, I think Proverbs 10 to 29 is less like a wall and more like a staircase, where you are being encouraged to make progress through various stages of life, and actually of rule, that as you read through these chapters, you're getting increasingly advanced in the kind of connectedness of the world that you're seeing, and also that as you go through, it's getting increasingly vocationally specific. And so there's a scholar called Chris Ansby who's talked a bit about this, and he imagines that maybe as you read through Proverbs, you're kind of moving from a youthful son to someone who's just kind of starting out in the world in 10 to 15, to someone who's acting as a magistrate perhaps in 1622, then a courtier advisor to the king in waiting. And what's happening as you go through the book is the implied context is getting closer and closer to the throne, as in you're getting closer and closer to rule as you go through. And also that the wisdom is getting increasingly complex. And so you begin in the opening chapters 10 to 12 of this section, where the big thing it seems to be laying out is what another scholar calls the ABCs of wisdom, as in, if you do the right thing, things go better. If you do the wrong thing, things go badly. It's kind of the kind of wisdom that I want my 3-year-old to learn. But then as you go through the book, it then gets increasingly complex when it sort of says that actually things don't always work out that way. And so how is it working? Well, you're getting this poetic education in naming things and making connections as you work through this book that is slowly advancing through different kind of stages, getting increasingly vocationally specific, and also sort of a bit more complex that goes through, which is supposed to train the prince in rule, something like that. One more thing about ruling through poetry. Of course, part of the sort of the thing to understand here is that Proverbs is not coded law. I think we often read it that way. And the now disgraced church leader Bill Hybels wrote a book which is all based in Proverbs about leadership, called Maxim. And I think the idea is that basically Proverbs is giving you a list of things to do. It's like a list of maxims, life hacks, tips for how to live, or something like that. And that's the way it's supposed to read 10 to 29. And I think some of the most disappointing misreadings of Proverbs that I've heard actually come from thinking that way, and that the basic way you're supposed to read Proverbs is it's all coded instruction and you should try to do it all. But I think it's a bit more complex than that. And there are lots of Proverbs as you read through the book that aren't really things you're supposed to do. And there's one, for example, where it talks about the fact that rich people take confidence in their riches, but poor people hear no bribe. And it's to do with patterns of behavior, as in, it's not a proverb that's telling you to be rich, and it's not a proverb that's telling you to be poor. It's not commending either state, in fact. It is rather telling you why people behave the way that they do. It's trying to get you to understand why in certain contexts, rich people or poor people might be more or less free, and why they behave the way that they do. And I think that's really important. So I don't think that Proverbs is mostly just trying to give you tips on how to live. I think it's trying to get you to understand why people act the way that they do, which of course will have lots of implications for how you should live. I mean, a lot of times the right implication of a Proverbs is to do it or to stop doing the thing that it's criticizing. But also there's a lot of stuff where it's getting to understand other people's motives and why people act the way that they do. And of course, this is really important for justice. Think back to 1 Kings chapter 3 and the parade example of Solomon's wisdom that's given at the end of 1 Kings chapter 3. And those two women who turn up with their baby, with the baby that belongs to one of them and not the other. And that's the question: what is it that Solomon needs to be able to do in that context? Is it that Solomon needs to be able to do the right thing? Well, on its own, not really, as it's obvious what the right thing is. And Solomon doesn't need wisdom to be able to work out what the right thing is. The right thing is to give the baby to its mother. And that's obvious. You don't require wisdom to be able to do that. You just require a little bit of righteousness and a bit of a desire to do what's right. But Solomon's problem is, how do you work out who the mother is in that context? And how do you work out who's lying? And what makes Solomon wise is his ability to give the judgment that actually cuts through people and that understands the way that people work and their motivations and what they're doing. And after all, if the actual mother of the baby would rather the baby died than be looked after by somebody else, then the baby's probably better off with the other woman anyway. But I guess more to the point, Solomon knew that his judgment would show who the real mother actually was in that situation. And that's very helpful, isn't it? Wisdom requires you to ruling requires you to understand people and to know why people behave the way that they do, to be able to see through lies, to be able to spot the sluggards, all of those things. And so the point is not just don't be a sluggard. And the point is, but rule in a way that understands why people are doing what they're doing. And this, I think, is part of the reason that the poetry is so helpful. Well, I'm running out of time. Two things, the Messiah and us. I think one of the things that's really helpful about the whole argument of Proverbs is that it helps us to see how this is ultimately a book about Jesus. I said a while ago that, let's see if I can find it, this chapter here, that at Proverbs 30 and 31, you have this pair of chapters at the end that kind of brings the book together. And chapter 30 is very striking because it begins with the confession that I have not learned wisdom. And there are all kinds of ways which it ties back to chapter 9. And it's quite a despairing chapter. And I think you're supposed to see it as something of a retrospective on the whole history of Israel. Again, there's lots of connections between Proverbs 30 and Deuteronomy 32. And so a retrospective on the whole history of Israel and her kings, that Israel never did provide a son who would walk in the fear of the Lord and rule rightly and judge rightly and build a better Eden. It never happened, as you read through. And so I have not learned wisdom. I've not attained to these things. But then in chapter 30, there's a quite clear allusion, I think basically a verbatim quote from 2 Samuel. And so Agur says, every word of God proves true. He's a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. And 2 Samuel 22 is David's great celebration of God's faithfulness to the Davidic covenant and the promise that David would one day have a son who would sit on his throne and rule rightly forever. And so even at Proverbs 30, it says, retrospectively, we never found a son like this. It's looking to the future saying, yeah, but I know that God has made a promise and we will have a son for sure. And then chapter 31, I think, is the counterpart to 30. It's a picture, I think, of that future son, an oracle about the son who will rule wisely. 31:8, and it's quite a famous verse these days. Proverbs 31:8, it's very important. It is directly, I would suggest, about Jesus, the Messiah, and the King who did open his mouth for the poor and the needy, and did open his mouth to provide justice for them. And then what about us? If Proverbs is all about the king, the wise king ruling wisely, if it's all about ultimately about Jesus, what about us? Well, again, I think the point is that the wise king, go back to 1 Kings chapters 1 to 11, was always meant to be a new Adam. That's the character of Solomon in 1 Kings 1 to 11. Humanity doing humanity's job, and of course doing that as the leader of a whole people who are living rightly. And I think that's right. I think Proverbs says to us that the only way that will ultimately happen is when Yahweh's son, the true king, when he comes. But then once the true king has come, you'd expect that he would lead a whole people ruling rightly and walking in righteousness, justice, and equity. Well, I think I've definitely had my time, and I'm supposed to ask if you've got questions. So let me stop there.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Gwilym. Thanks so much for joining us and giving us that. Very stimulating. Anyone for questions? I will open it up. Just unmute and shout.
Can I ask who's Lemuel?
Lemuel, yeah, great. I think both in chapter 30 and in 31, you're supposed to think that the names are kind of riddles rather than strong biographical statements. And so I think that when it says Agur in chapter 30, the son of Yakeh, I actually think that it's a way of talking about, I think, Israel probably as a sojourner in chapter 30. And then I think, likewise with Lemuel, I think the etymology of the name as a kind of, my preferred lexicon has it as kind of belonging to God. I think that might be more important than trying to work out who Lemuel is. And I think maybe it is supposed to be a kind of a riddling name rather than a kind of a reference to a particular historical character. And that's how I'd read it. And then again, people sometimes translate it as King Lemuel, who was king of Massa. But actually, I think Massa means oracle, as in like a prophetic burden, there and in chapter 30 as well. That's how I'd read it anyway. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in if no one else is. Can you give us any help on how you preach it, how you teach it, given that different way of looking at it through the frame? Does that help you put together a sermon series on it?
I hope so. Yeah, I think one of the things that's tricky about preaching Proverbs is how you preach Proverbs full stop, as in say, leaving aside any thought about how you go to Jesus and all of those things. It's just, how do you capture the sense of kind of interconnectedness and of riddling and punning and going slowly and really mulling over the way that stuff relates that you get in a two-line proverb in a sermon. That's like, how do you do that? And probably there's a whole kind of art of proverbial preaching to be kind of examined. I guess something that I found helpful as a general principle in preaching is that this is one of the reasons why I think it's important that I read that I keep trying to read the passage in my sermon so that something of the aesthetic of the passage comes through as I'm preaching. Although the irony of that is not lost on me, given how little I actually read out of Proverbs in the talk I just gave. But yeah, I do think that kind of preaching the frame might be helpful and kind of saying, actually, try to think, Proverbs is trying to teach us how to rule, as in that's what Proverbs is trying to teach us to do. And ultimately, human dominion is only going to come in the Messiah. And so all the way through Proverbs, I'm ultimately looking to the Messiah for right naming and comparing and understanding, seeing through people, all of those things. But then also it helps me to kind of go, but I'm still training people as I read it as well in how to think and how to understand people and the way the world works so that we can rule better, and so that we can do a better job of doing good and serving people and understanding how to bring justice and all of those kind of ways, with all of the kind of the qualifications we want to put on that in the light of the gospel and all of those things too. So I do think it might help you to preach it better. I think. What do you think, Tom?
It's always that. Well, the tricky question is, I guess, what practically, what do? You get those middle chapters, that curriculum for wisdom. Do you take big chunks? Do you take little chunks? Do you do themes? These are familiar questions. But what would you do? Have you done it? Have you preached it?
I've done a little bit of thinking about this. I've not done as much as I'd like to. I'm not quite executive enough about what I get to preach to be able to just dictate and say, I'm going to do this because I have to do work, I have to do this properly. And so it's kind of been on the back burner a bit to do a proper series in bigger bits. Something that a friend of mine called Toby noticed was that maybe in chapters 10 to 22, maybe the child rearing proverbs might be quite significant for structuring it. And so, for example, in 10 verse 1, you have a wise son, and then he basically looked for those kind of a wise son, a foolish son things as you go through. And it does kind of give you some chunks. So again, 13:1, a wise son, here's his father's instruction, and it kind of helps you to sort of chunk it up a bit. And that kind of is a useful thing as it's begin to go with chunks. I think, again, I don't mind doing thematic stuff, but I think if it's true that there's a movement from sort of something which is a bit more ABCs to something which is a bit more sort of specific and a slightly more complex world, you'd want to reflect that in the way you did thematic stuff. So you'd want to sort of think about not just what does you learn about friendship in kind of, I mean, actually friendship doesn't really come up in Proverbs until after chapter 15, but not just what do you learn about friendship in sort of chapters 15 to 22, but also do you get taken further if you sort of compare that what you find out later on? I think certainly with, for example, money, I think the way that Proverbs talks about money earlier on in the book is much simpler and sort of more clear cut than the way that it talks about money later on. And again, likewise, the way you treat the king, it's much more straightforward. You just obey the king early on in the book. And then as you go through, you increasingly get the thought that the king could be rogue as you kind of go through the book. And so I think if I was going to do it thematically, I'd want to make sure that I had thought about whether there was development of that theme across the book, rather than just assuming that it's all just kind of, let's just say some stuff on friendship and kind of lose all the texture. Yeah, whether you could, I mean, like, I think, I know Johnny Jukes has preached through the book from start to finish in sort of 10 verse chunks. And if you wanted to do that, a comment like some of the evangelical commentaries, like Walker's commentary, he is quite helpful at trying to think about what individual sections are saying as he kind of goes through. And that might not be a bad place to start. Yeah.
Could it be that there's a danger in actually forcing Proverbs into a sort of contemporary evangelical preaching style? Maybe it needs to be preached in a different way completely. Maybe not for 3 headings with alliterative titles. Maybe it ought to be preached in I don't know, I'm not wise enough to know which way to preach it, but in a more poetic way, maybe, or in a more creative way.
Yes, you definitely want to be a bit more deliberative, wouldn't you? And trying to kind of to make the ways that you sort of ponder over the connections and things. Yeah, and that's right. I agree. I agree, and I have wondered whether it's better for the kind of the for other contexts or not. But yeah, it's a really good question. And also what we do is we preach the bits that preach. So we preach 1 to 9, and then we do like a couple of sample sermons on 10 to 29, and then we preach 30 to 31 because of that, because we can't quite work out how to preach it in between.
Tassian, you want to go?
Yeah, maybe. As you were describing these chapters, sort of looking at the world and trying to name it and distinguish and recognize what's going on, just reminded me of what Adam was doing in the garden.
Yeah,
giving the command to rule and to name the animals and sort of make order in a wild world. Is there that line as well from Adam then to these how to rule, and in that way perhaps to go on to Christ?
Yeah, well, exactly. I just listened to the Bible Project's stuff on wisdom literature, actually. Well, they've done kind of 2 rounds, and I thought their first round was quite disappointing. So it's like the first round was back in 2016, their podcast. I thought they were a shame. But then they've had another crack, kind of a bit more recently, so like 2019 or something. And what they do, I think is brilliant. They basically start by saying, okay, well, let's look at Genesis 2 and 3. They're a little bit egalitarian in their take on Genesis 2 and 3. As like, I don't take everything they say, but they look at Genesis 2 and 3 and to talk about how that's working. Then they look at Solomon in 1 Kings 1 to 11, and they notice the fact that actually 1 Kings 1 to 11 is very strongly linked back to Genesis 2 and 3, which is definitely true. And then they basically plug all of the wisdom books, so Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and again, it's really helpful for Job to see this, and Song of Songs, again, really helpful for that. They plug all of them back into 1 Kings and then back into Genesis. And when I think, for example, for Song of Songs and for Job, it's actually quite transformative to read them as though they might be thinking of Genesis as you read them, and really helps to make sense of how they are in fact Christian scripture, I think. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things you want to say, is that exactly like this is like Adam. And I think there are lots of ways in Proverbs 1 to 9 that we're being reminded of Eden and the tree of life and the knowledge of good and bad and all of those things. So I think it's exactly the right sort of set of connections. And I think it's really interesting when you get to Ephesians in the New Testament that Ephesians is very strongly linked back to Genesis 2 and 3 in all sorts of ways as you read through Ephesians. But again, Ephesians talks about walking in wisdom. And then interestingly, straight away, starts talking about marriage and how men and women relate to each other. And I think that there are a lot of reasons why, if you have connected Genesis 2 and 3, 1 Kings 1 to 11, and then wisdom stuff, suddenly that all makes sense when you get to Ephesians. You're like, yeah, of course. And of course, that's right, that wisdom, rule, men and women and marriage and Christ are all sort of very tightly bound together. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
I think that's probably our time. So thank you very much again, Gwilym. That's been really stimulating.